Welcome to the Creators with AI podcast. I'm your host, David, and this is a show where we share insights about the future of artificial intelligence and how it will affect the lives of people working in the creative industries. On today's show, we chat with Dr. Ruth Morgan, the award-winning Vice Dean of Interdisciplinary Entrepreneurship at University College London. In our conversation, we discuss her roles at UCL and her mission to bridge the gap in forensic science using the metaphor of a meadow to illustrate the importance of diversity and interconnectedness when solving complex global issues. We talk about AI's potential and its dual-use implications, how it can revolutionize our lives, and its potentially transformative impact on forensic science, the legal system, and education. At the end of the conversation, we had a lively chat about assigning gender to AI and what we should name it, or should we name it at all. Dr. Morgan obtained her PhD from Oxford University and is currently the Vice Dean of Interdisciplinary Entrepreneurship at the UCL Faculty of Engineering Sciences. She's a founder and director of the UCL Center for the Forensic Sciences, where her research group addresses critical questions for the accurate interpretation of forensic science evidence, the role of science in policy, and interdisciplinary perspectives and synergies between engineering and the arts and humanities, especially when solving complex global challenges. She's won multiple P.W. Allen Awards, which are issued by the Chartered Society of the Forensic Sciences for the most meritorious paper published in Science and Justice each year. She's an active member of the Young Scientist community at the World Economic Forum, where she was also a member of the Global Future Council on Scientific Collaboration and the Global Future Council on VR and AR. She was a specialist advisor to the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee's inquiry on forensic science, and she's a well-known speaker and commentator on forensic science, the role of science in policy, and the importance of interdisciplinarity. She's even done a TED Talk you can find on YouTube. Links to Ruth's profile and social media will be in the show notes and on our website at creativeswith.ai. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this lively conversation with Ruth. Hi Ruth, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Good, thanks. Good. Yeah, it's summer in the university, which is an interesting time. It's quieter but busier. Madly writing, planning, but all good. All good, thank you.
I was going to say, is that the time you actually get to sit and do some work while the students aren't there, so you can spend your time writing your papers and all the stuff that you actually need to get through?
Yeah, and creating better spaces and thinking and catching up with those people that are such great value to connect with it, regularly and find out what they're doing and get that inspiration ready for the new year. Yeah.
Brilliant. So we met at Fearless event back in May, I think it was already, which seems crazy that it was that long ago. And I know you're super busy, so to start off with, thanks very much for your time today. I've given an intro, we'll introduce the podcast, but maybe if you just gave a couple of minutes and just introduce yourself to everybody and sort of give them a little bit about your background and that sort of thing, just to set the tone.
So I'm Professor of Crime and Forensic Science at University College London, UCL, and I've been there a number of years now. I set up the Centre for Forensic Sciences back in 2010, and that was to really address the big gap that we could see in forensic science when it came to being able to interpret what evidence means. So lots of people were doing great jobs in terms of developing the technological capabilities for analysing particular forms of material and detecting them quicker, more effectively, more robustly. But there was this part of the process in terms of being able to understand what that actually means. So we can find your DNA, but when we find it on a knife, what does that mean? Did you touch the knife 3 weeks ago, or did you use it to commission a crime? So those kinds of questions, it is always about the physical evidence itself, but also the people that are engaging with it, the examiners, the scientists, the legal professionals and the juries. So it's a very sort of tech and people approach to things. And so we've been doing that since 2010. So I'm also, more recently, I've taken on a post within the Faculty of Engineering. So I'm Vice Dean for Interdisciplinarity and Entrepreneurship, which is a bit of a mouthful. Essentially what we're trying to do is get an overview of what's going on across the whole space in engineering and bring in the insights that exist in all the different fields together. So building bridges between disciplines, and not just within engineering. I'm working very closely with a fantastic colleague in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and we're looking to bring together the insights from the arts, the humanities, the social sciences with engineering and science, so that we can find innovative ways of thinking about existing challenges that might find us ways of making breakthroughs. And more than that, it's how do we get what's going on and the capabilities that exist within the university out to the real world? So how can we be building bridges between the university and industry and government and policy and the charity sector to make sure that what's happening in the university is meaningful, is going to engage with real world challenges and be usable and actually affect the changes that we need.
That's really interesting. And it feels like one of the struggles, because obviously I work a bit with public sector and innovation also. And one of the big challenges that we have there is how do you move something that's a proof of concept or a bit of research into business as usual and have that adopted? And that feels like a very similar type challenge that that you're facing and trying to address, which is really interesting, and that's really cool. So when we met at the Fearless event, you were talking about you did a great speech, and you talked about a meadow and bees. And again, I don't want to do you any disservice, so if you could maybe just touch on that a little bit, because I think it's a good way to explain kind of what you're talking about, and then I have some questions about how that then, how AI might be able to support that, and we can start to go in that direction. But again, I think it adds a little bit of context, and I think it's a really interesting way to think about it. So if you wouldn't mind maybe telling everybody about that.
So I think it's all really come about by sort of thinking about the big global challenges that exist are still here, and we're not making the progress that we would have hoped that we might make. We're not getting fast enough. We're not getting far enough, quick enough. And there's a quote from Einstein, which I find quite fascinating, which is, we're not going to solve our problems with the same thinking that created them. And so where a lot of this has come from is this idea that actually, if we want to tackle big, complex challenges, AI is a great example, we have to be thinking differently to how we maybe have been thinking before. And what has happened as we've been working in this very interdisciplinary way within the university is that we've realised that, generally speaking, you only really find those different ways of thinking about things, or those different perspectives on things that just create those light bulb moments when you're in what we call the proverbial meadow. So if you think about a meadow, it's got just loads of different plants. It's got flowers, it's got grasses, it's got a huge diversity. It's all out there, and it's an ecosystem. So it's not just the plants. It's all about the type of soil. It's about the weather, but it's also about the animals and the insects that are part of that ecosystem. And when it all works together, it really thrives. And the big contrast, I think, between a meadow and, say, a field of corn or a field of wheat is that in the meadow you've just got everything all together, all connected in it looks quite complex, quite chaotic, but it really works. Whereas in a field of corn, you've got very neat, straight rows for a very different reason, but you generally want one crop. So our metaphor, if you like, is that we want to be in the meadow. We want to create opportunities for people to get out into the meadow and therefore be bees. So bees are the insect that the research is showing us are absolutely critical to so much to food production, to thriving ecosystems. Bees travel from plant to plant. They collect pollen as they go. They cross-pollinate as they go. But they also, honeybees specifically, come back to the nest and transform all those insights, all that pollen, into something completely different, into honey. And that honey can then be useful in a whole range of other different settings and sectors. So that's really what we're trying to do with the work that we're doing. We've called it the Arista Institute because Arista is short for Aristeus, which is the Greek god of beekeeping. So we want to be creating those opportunities for people to get out into the meadow, to explore, to have those conversations with people who have different perspectives, different disciplinary backgrounds to them, different generational stages, different career stages, that diversity, and then to be able to have the space to really think about it, to make those connections and hopefully produce that honey that's going to really help us with the breakthroughs.
That was way better than I would have done. So I'm glad I got you to do that instead of me. A couple of interesting things from that. One is I find it quite interesting that there was a Greek god of honeybees as well. So that sort of, that shows you how important that was and has been recognized as being important for millennia. So that's one thing that sort of jumped out at me. I guess my question is, and I totally agree with you, and I think in education and in government and everything, people tend to be very siloed in what they do. And people become specialists in their particular area, which is fine. And everybody, that's sort of how the world is now. People specialize in whatever their skill is, and we all work together. Except we only work together when we have to work together. And I completely agree with you that there needs to be more of that chat. So my big question for you is how do you see, or do you see AI as an enabler for that type of communication and that working together and that those cross-disciplinary conversations? And if so or not, how do you think that might play out?
So it's a big question, and it's a brilliant question, and I don't know if I fully know the answer, but you've often said you're a glass half full kind of person on this, and I'd say the same. I think there absolutely has to be ways in which AI is going to create so many opportunities to do this bigger and better, and in ways that we probably can't quite imagine right now. Certainly in terms of the being able to gain insight from broader and more diverse perspectives, that seems to me something quite exciting. I think the capabilities of synthesis that AI has the potential to deliver is something very, very interesting. I can see that there might be ways where human ingenuity and AI capabilities in that sort of space put together could take us in massive leaps forward to what the incremental steps that we're probably looking at right now. So I think there's a huge amount of potential. I think we do have to think about how we navigate that and how we ensure that we don't have gaps, that there are voices that are not currently there that need to be there. And I think that's something that AI has the potential to offer. At the moment, obviously, there's lots of talk about the fact that an awful lot of with generative AI, there's an awful lot of skew in terms of how those models have been produced and where they're getting their insights and data from, which leaves out large parts of the world. So there are a few things that need to be looked at quite carefully for that. But in terms of the capacity for synthesis and the capacity for generating multiple different outcomes with the same starting point, we're getting quite exciting. And I guess it's similar to drug discovery and those kinds of applications at the moment, that you could do an awful lot more quickly. It's still going to require the human, I think, to be teasing out where there's value, what kind of works, what doesn't, to sense check a lot of these things. But in terms of creating more opportunities for making those connections and the synthesis that comes from them, a watch this space kind of moment, I think.
I think there's massive potential. Of course, it's the dual use problem, right? Like everything that can be used for good can also be used for bad. So okay, we know that's a given. What I wondered is, or I guess the way I was thinking about it before is, when you ask, I don't know, ChatGPT or something, a question at the minute, we don't know well, take a step back. If I ask you a question, I don't know where you're gathering your information to answer that question, but you have knowledge from all sorts of fields. You've got forensics, you've got English, you've got math, you've got some physics. Like, you've got a whole range of stuff that you've studied, that you grew up with, that you saw when you were a kid. All of that stuff swirls around in your head, and then you come up with an answer. It's the same thing with AI, right? Everybody says, oh, it's a black box, but so are humans. Humans are the ultimate black box, because even if you ask a human, it can't tell you where it got its information, whereas sometimes AI at least can.
Humans really are quite... It's very interesting how we think we've made a very logical decision, but actually the things...
it's not at all.
The technologies now are showing us that what we think we're doing actually isn't what we're doing, and it's fascinating. Sorry. Right. We're already off track, and it's great. I love it. I was just having lunch with my wife, and we were talking about this exact thing, and she said I think she was watching something on Netflix. I'll try and find out from her, and I'll put it in the show notes if anybody wants to follow up. But essentially, they did this test where they
took somebody and they put a fake scar on their face. And then they said, okay, we're going to send you in for this job interview and we want to see how people react to you with the scar on your face. So they had them sort of go around for like an hour or something and wait around and do all this stuff, and you know how it is with production. There's all this production crew around and there's all sorts of busy stuff. So they're kind of sitting on the side. And then they basically said, oh, we need to touch up your makeup and stuff before you go in. And they take the scar off. But the people don't know that the scar's not there because there's not a mirror. So they go in thinking there's a scar on their face. And they have this interview and then they ask them about, so then the team interviews them, the person afterwards, and says, oh, how did the interview go? And it was showing that they would say, oh yeah, well, they said this thing that was, they were directly commenting on the scar. But basically they interpreted what they were told. And in some cases completely invented stuff that they thought that the person had said, or that, that they just said, oh yeah, they talked about this thing because it was recorded. So they knew exactly what was said and what wasn't said. And it was really, really interesting. And that goes back to, it's the perception. I think a lot of stuff is what we expect to hear is what we hear.
What you expect to see.
And what you expect to see and all that sort of stuff. So, from a human perspective, that's super interesting. And it's something I even noticed when I very first started recording myself and doing videos and things, is I would record a video and I'd go back and watch it later and I'd go, but that's not what I said. And so what I actually said is different than what I thought I said in my head, which is really off-putting. That is super off-putting when that happens. And after talking to a few people who sort of did that in the beginning, they also said the same thing. So you kind of think one thing, but sometimes you say another. Like, it's not like you tell a completely different story, but just single word choices and things like that. And then, so that's just a little clue into it. And so the whole concept that, we have to know what AI is doing all the time and all of that, I think is a total red herring, because we're never going to know. And we don't know about humans anyway. So to bring it all the way back around, what I think is potentially interesting about AI is it has a much, much larger body of knowledge on which to draw. So I was just thinking obviously in a forensic context. I don't know how you may or may not use AI in forensics. So we can touch on that at some point as well, maybe. But my thought process is that if you asked AI a question, it might be able to pull in more knowledge from physics or from chemistry or from some other discipline that you don't really know much about. And it would bring in a whole side that you've never even considered before. And the power there is what I think is really interesting and also scary for some people, because humans are quite simple and we are quite limited. And you start saying, well, this thing's now 100 times smarter, even though it's not smarter. It just has more data to pull from. I don't know. I mean, do you agree? Do you see that as an opportunity? I don't know. I'm kind of talking, and I apologize. I'm talking a lot, but
no. It's. I think this is what great conversation is. I think that's such a fascinating point, because I was thinking about this because there's probably a couple of areas in which we're beginning to see the use of AI in forensic science. The first one is in recognizing patterns. So like with in the medical sphere, being able to identify potential cancers in screening materials. We're looking at to what degree can we train machine learning to identify important patterns, whether that's with footwear marks or whether it's in anthropology, so looking at skeletal remains and specific features in skeletal remains. And so that's the one aspect. And then the other aspect is finding patterns in the first place. So the rise of digital materials in forensic science is quite extraordinary. So we've got finding those patterns in the first place in digital evidence. So the anecdotal evidence from investigators I've spoken to is that of crimes that happen in the physical world, we're looking between 80 and 90% of them now have digital evidence as a component. So materials on your phone or on computers. So everything from messages to call log data to browser history to geolocation data. So there's now this huge amount of data, which means that we've gone from we're going through this interesting transition from the traditional forensic science, which Sherlock Holmes really embodies, that trying to find that tiny speck of material and then infer meaning, as much meaning as you possibly can from this tiny, tiny amount of material to what we're transitioning into this time where actually we've got so much data. It's a very different challenge. It's about trying to find what's relevant in it, so the needle in the proverbial haystack. So that's been quite an interesting space to be considering AI in, I think, because there's a huge amount of capability, but because you've got the science coming into contact with what's going on in a court, and in science you've got a lot of provisionality, a lot of revising of your theory as you falsify your hypothesis, and you develop as things fail, and you revise in the light of new information. In a court of law, you've got to be beyond reasonable doubt. So actually some of the interesting conversations around this have really been about, to what degree do we need explainable AI tools? To what degree do we need to be able to explain to a jury exactly how an AI tool has come up with a particular result? And you've also got the fact that this is a marketized system. So I guess the best well-known example of this is the software that's been created to discern between mixed DNA profile samples. So yes, there's been a lot of legal conversation around, should these companies have to reveal their code so that it's possible to understand how these tools have actually made conclusions about how many people are present in this DNA profile and who is present in that profile. So I think that's a really interesting question. I think because this sort of explainability, the transparency is so important in legal proceedings, particularly if you ever have to go back. So if there is an appeal and you have to go back and re-examine evidence 5 years, 10 years later, the level of transparency in terms of how interpretations about what evidence meant is important. But your point is an incredibly salient one, because a forensic examiner who's looked at a piece of material has used their expertise and used their experience and come up with a conclusion. And they might well have documented how they've done that, but as we were just saying, that doesn't actually cover the whole process.
No.
So it's a really I really like that perspective on it. I'm going to think about that a bit more.
The other thing, obviously, is the march of technology, right? So, my wife, again, I'm going to talk about my wife a lot this episode because she's totally into forensics and she loves all that stuff. So I hear tons and tons of podcasts about, investigations into cases and all that sort of stuff. So, but there's all this stuff where they can go back to evidence from, 15, 20 years ago, and they can go back and reanalyze it because the technology has moved on. Mm. And I think you're absolutely right. And I do think it's probably important that maybe even if those companies don't have to provide that information publicly, that can just be kept in escrow somewhere or locked away somewhere, but the methodology is actually recorded somewhere, so that 15 years from now, if that person's, I don't know, maybe on death row or something, and they come back and they go, well, look, you need to go back and re-examine that evidence because the technology is way better now than it used to be. And maybe they find a discrepancy and then they go back to court. Then at that point, they can go, well, 15 years ago, this is how they analyzed this data. And this is why they came up with the answer that they did. But now our technology is way better and we understand that, and then you can make a comparison. But like you said, if you don't have that, you can't do that. And you just go, well, that's what it said at the time. And they'll assume that, I could see where it would make it easier. The other thing that popped into my head when you were talking about that is the medical stuff. And I was at Oxford University at a conference, and one of the medical researchers stood up and was talking about some of the breast cancer identification stuff, which is actually very, very good now. And what was really funny about that is he said in the beginning, they thought that it didn't work because it was coming up with lots of false positives all the time. And so they just kept trying to retrain it because they're like, well, it's not working. And it wasn't until 4 years later that they realized that it was actually correct. It was identifying it so far ahead that they couldn't even realize that that's what it was doing. So they thought it was broken when it wasn't actually broken.
But actually it was identifying things even earlier than...
Even earlier than a human could. And that's another funny side to this that might, seems like that might have a forensic application as well, that if some of this stuff is happening and you're getting really funny results that you don't expect, maybe don't completely discount all of that it's broken. It may actually be doing something that you don't, like we can't even do it as humans. We can't tell the difference. I mean, he said it was something about the resolution. So the computer could work to a much finer resolution. It can work to like 10 decimal places of color gradient or something where the human eye can't see anywhere near that. And so, and a screen much less can't display those fine gradients between it. So there's no physical way that a human could see what the computer could see in the data, because the data was much finer. So that's where they, and please don't anybody quote me on this. I'm not a medical researcher. And if some scan doesn't work right, it's not my fault. But from the best of my memory, this was the reason. And so again, I think there's huge potential for it, around forensics and medicine and all that sort of stuff.
It's the new microscope, maybe.
It is
It's enabling us to see that next level of detail that we can't see with the naked eye. But
yeah, the other side of that is what it's also put a microscope on is looking at humans, I think. And we're not as complex as we like to think we are.
Oh,
I think. And I think that's what AI is beginning to highlight is that a computer can have an algorithm that essentially people can't tell is not a human. So does that mean I think this is a like pub conversation with your mates kind of thing, but do you know what I mean? It's almost like, what does that mean for people who've always thought, humans are the most complex thing on the planet. And now it's kind of like, well, some guys at a university wrote an algorithm that essentially is a human. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're straying way off topic.
Definitely watch this space on that. But that's an interesting one, though, isn't it? Because it's about, because there's often quite a lot of talk in terms about the capability of AI and therefore the potential power of AI. But that sort of line of thought actually means that the AI doesn't actually have to be powerful, but it has to be able to be perceived as powerful. So it doesn't actually have to have the capability, but it has to be able to elicit that kind of reaction in a human, say. So if it can mimic the language and the phraseology and the content that is difficult to discern between human and AI, actually maybe it doesn't matter how capable the AI is, it has power because of the way humans interact with it. It's that sort of path you start going down, isn't it? Which is quite an interesting one.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and I've talked to such a wide range of people everywhere from, people who've been in defense and, sort of, ex-admirals in the Royal Navy to people in PR to people in education. And it's been really interesting to kind of get everyone's view and to try and sort of make some sense of it in my head, which is the whole reason I do the podcast, because I'm just trying to make sense of it. And I thought, maybe some other people are trying to make sense of it as well. I do want to slightly bring us back, though. We've got slightly off track, and I did actually have a few things that I wanted to kind of dig in on with you a little bit. So I know you've done a TED Talk, and that's online and on YouTube, and we can find that everywhere. And in that, you talked a lot about creativity and imagination in science. And I wonder if you think, or if you have any thoughts about how AI might serve as sort of a catalyst to help maybe, I don't know, foster innovative thinking or something like, something in both the scientific and the creative domains. And I just didn't know if maybe you had some thoughts around that.
It's a really great question. I've been thinking a lot about the role of creativity in science, and we've done some really interesting projects where we've brought artists and scientists together and got them to share their perspectives, and realizing that there's actually so much art and craft in science, but there's also so much science in the arts as well. So it's a really rich place to start pulling on that thread. I think one of the things that AI is already doing, and will probably do even more in terms of helping us think that through is that it really does raise the question about what is creativity in science, and to what degree do we need it, and to what degree does it open up opportunities. And I think then you get to a point of trying to work out, well, what is it that brings about real innovation. And I guess it comes back a little bit to the point you made earlier about specialism versus generalism, and the idea that traditionally, in particularly in the sciences, we've really focused on creating specialists, and our education system and our disciplinary classifications really promote the idea of finding your niche and going deep into it and becoming really, really expert in something very, very focused. And there are so many big challenges out there where that is exactly what we need, and that's why it's come about like that. But you also need the people who are at the intersections, who can spot the patterns, who can bring things together, and who can do that more, I suppose, lateral thinking work, so that it isn't actually only when we're forced to work together that we do. It actually becomes a much more dynamic, ongoing conversation that enables what's going on at the intersections to come to the fore. And so I guess that's where I'm quite excited in terms of what AI might be able to do in the very short term. I think because there's so much hype around AI, that it's actually a really nice opening gambit to building bridges across different disciplines with people with different backgrounds, because everyone's aware that AI is going to change things. Everyone's thinking through, how does it change my particular world or my particular field or the way I'm doing my work. So it's a really amazing point of common ground, which is really exciting because it creates those opportunities for those conversations. And I'm a really big believer in conversation, particularly the kinds of conversations that evolve and go on. I've also been known to say that we need to have people in research at the table, not on tap. So when there's a big problem, traditionally you wheel the scientist in to find a solution, whereas my argument in that particular example is, if the scientist had been at the table in the years, months coming up to that point, that kind of thinking would already be embedded in the way that we're tackling challenges, and it might not have got to the point where we need someone to come in and fix the problem. So there's a real interesting thing about conversation and therefore what AI can do. And then there's the technical capability of AI is, I guess, the third thing. To what degree is it going to be possible to essentially imagine what could be possible with the help of AI? And there's that amazing phrase that, if you build it, they will come. But there's also that you can't be what you can't see. So there's those sort of things in tension that I think, if we can imagine a really fantastic outcome, we can work towards it. But also, if we can see it before it exists, which I think is where AI can help us, we might get there quicker, and we might be able to navigate some of the unintended consequences as well as the intended outcomes. Don't know if that resonates with you.
No, it does. It's all very thought provoking as well. Yeah, we're certainly at an inflection point, I think, where it can kind of go either way, and it can be used for all sorts of things. I like what you were saying though about sort of having the scientist at the table earlier, and I think I absolutely agree. And again, we agree on this standpoint that there should be more interdisciplinary communication and working together. And again, in education and public sector are the perfect examples, but that happens in industry and everywhere else anyway. And you're absolutely right. I think if we can get that done sooner, then that will be great. And I do genuinely think that AI might be a really good catalyst to start to make that happen. Just again, because it's pulling from all sorts of places and we don't know where it's pulling from. And it just has a bigger pool of data.
And I guess it's interesting when you start thinking about a lot of the conversations that are going on specifically around AI. and particularly sort of regulation of AI. And it's interesting to me who's involved in those conversations, and it's predominantly the usual suspects. So it's the people you'd expect to be at that table having those conversations. And I wonder what might happen if there was an openness to bring in a broader range of people with different skills and expertise, but also different generations, and certainly different geographical locations and different cultural heritages. And I wonder if you might have it'd be a much messier conversation, it'd be a much broader conversation, but I wonder if it might get us somewhere that could actually get us the level of safeguarding that we need, but also the openness that we need for the innovation, so that we really can make sure that we're leveraging the good that is possible. I suppose, I wonder what voices we're not hearing in those conversations, and whether it's possible to broaden that conversation.
This is going to sound really funny, but what we're talking about and what you're talking about at the minute reminds me very much of the whole reason that we built the internet, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Exactly right.
That's literally why Tim Berners-Lee built the internet, because that was exactly the point of it, was to be able to enable, certainly in the beginning, scientists and researchers and people in academia to communicate with each other and to be able to share ideas and to have those voices and to have that. And I think, broadly speaking, that's happened, but we're now on to sort of, I don't know what people say, like Web3 or whatever, but we're much further down the road in that basic communication. But what's funny is we've moved the needle so far from where it was in the very beginning. If you think back in the 50s and the 60s, when the internet was I guess that was DARPA back in the very, very beginning. And then, sort of the World Wide Web kind of became more and more popular. And it really wasn't till probably the early to mid 90s, when you had these sort of international, sort of BBSs and stuff like that, where you could, they were just text-based forums where you could go and chat. And those were amazing. But we've moved on so far past that. But we've also created tons of problems. Like, look at social media. Like, social media in the beginning was great, and it was great fun. And again, people had amazing conversations, and it was really fun, and it was fantastic. And then look at where we are now.
And I think what you're sort of outlining, I think, is this really interesting concept of, with any kind of new capability or innovation, there's those who are using it for good intentions and with lofty aims and really beautiful, actually, goals. But with every endeavour like that, almost always history shows us that there are unintended consequences that happen. And then you've also then got those who come to use that capability or technology for ill, let's say, and they have both intended consequences and unintended consequences as well. So it's quite an interesting matrix of the intended goals and the unintended consequences. And I wonder if, can we learn from history? And with AI being at the point we're at right now, is it possible to build an AI world, an ecosystem where AI is part of that ecosystem that has resilience to enable all those intended good consequences to become realised, but also safeguard against those unintended consequences, or at least build resilience to them so that the harm is minimised? It seems to me like that should be possible. And if we'd had those conversations at the beginning of the internet, how different would it look now? And
do you think we could have we could have, it's so hard to do, like, looking back, right? Because you get 20/20 vision looking backwards. Could we have predicted what Twitter would be? I'm not sure that anybody back then could have come up with that idea and really, kind of predicted what that would turn into at some point. So it's very difficult. One thing that popped into my mind when you were saying that is I started to wonder, if you asked AI about the unintended consequences of developing a particular tool, if it could come up with a bunch of ideas that are things that people might not have ever thought about. I've never done it myself, so I might have to play around with that later just to see what it says. Because it'll probably come up with stuff that seems like nonsense to us now. And we'll be like,
but with,
that'll
with
never happen. That would never happen that way. And then it'll be absolutely correct.
So this idea between the black box of AI and the black box that people represent is interesting to me. Science fiction writing has always been able to go forward, pull on a thread, take things to their logical conclusion, and to do that in multiple different spheres and dimensions. So I sort of wonder if you could take a science fiction approach with an AI. That could be quite fun.
Ooh, science fiction. Okay. Here's a question for you. There's 3 basic views in science fiction of the future. There's Star Trek, which is the utopian, people are scientists, we're exploring other galaxies in the trying to make peace everywhere we go. And, everybody seems quite educated. Nobody needs for anything. There's no money because nobody needs money because everything just gets made for you. That's one version. There's Mad Max, which is the other version, which is it just descends into complete and total collapse and utter chaos. And there are no computers or anything left, but it is literally, we've taken steps back and it's just chaos everywhere. And then there's also I think Dune is the 3rd version, which is, I don't know how much you know about or if you've read the books, but
no.
Basically in the Dune universe, what's happened is that humans went through this process where they had AI. They then realized that AI was terrible, so they killed it all. It caused a war. And the humans basically turned the AI off, and they made this decision that computers had to be stupid. So it was more like calculators. So nobody's allowed to use computers or anything like that. So they don't exist in the universe except for on the spaceships, which are those big ships that transport everybody around. So those are the 3 sort of views of kind of the science fiction view of the future. Which one? Where are you placing your bets?
I think, glass half full, I've got to go with humans. I've got to go Star Trek. What would you go for?
I'm hoping for Star Trek. I fear that we're going to end up with Mad Max.
Mad Max, yeah. But I think that at least with like these kinds of conversations are happening, and I think there are so many. The people you've been speaking to on the podcast are all awesome people. They've had brilliant insights. I've got to. I think I put my hope in human ingenuity and the potential for achieving good. Oof, gosh, I'm gonna have nightmares now.
I hope for Star Trek, but I suspect there might be a Mad Max period that we're going to have to go through. And I had a co-host when I started the show, Dee Dee, and Dee Dee was a little bit more cautious and a little bit more kind of glass half empty. She thinks that it's ultimately going to, be the ruin of humans. But I'm trying to represent her view correctly. But I think her position is that AI itself isn't going to say, I need to get rid of humans and it's going to come up and kill everybody. It's the socioeconomic stuff around the use of AI and the knock-on effect that AI is going to have that's going to cause the problems. And then humans are going to wipe each other out because we're humans. So that goes back to the sort of the Mad Max middle bit. If we can survive the Mad Max middle bit it's very possible, tons of people could be out of work. We're going to have a situation where a lot of people aren't going to be working. There's not going to be much money around. Governments are going to have to come up with some sort of a solution, whether that's, UBI or something like that. But then the governments are going to start to run out of money. So then what happens when the governments run out of money? Do you know what I mean? So that there's potential that this could all go wrong. But hopefully the technology and, some of the other technology can bolster us a little bit and get us through that period. It's going to be awkward no matter what, but it's where we end up when we come out the other end. Yeah. Star Trek, hopefully, maybe Mad Max. I think that's probably it. So I haven't asked directly, but do you use AI at all yourself these days?
I think what's
I'm putting
interesting
you
about
on
that
the spot.
question, yeah, what's interesting about that question is that half the time I'm not sure we're aware we are using AI. There's so much AI integrated into so many everyday things, isn't there? So yes, I use AI. Am I explicitly using it? So we're beginning to experiment a little bit with the LLM capabilities and particularly in the synthesis space. So is it possible to, if you're doing a systematic review of all the literature on a particular topic and you identify all the key papers, being able to use say ChatGPT to offer synthesized summaries of the key findings in particular papers, and then start to think about finding those themes and connections. I think we're still quite cautious because we're double checking everything, and we're having to. So I think we're sort of using it in a dual way at the moment. So we're using it as a tool and testing to see quite how it can help us achieve tasks that we've been doing manually for a number of years. So it's a bit of a work in progress. It's a bit experimental, and I guess at the moment I'm sort of dipping in and dipping out and seeing what's possible. But every time you dip back in, it's changed a bit. It's come on further. And I remember experimenting with it maybe last December, and and then coming back to it in February and being really quite surprised at just really how much more nuanced those kinds of summaries were. So yeah, I think the other thing we're beginning to think about is, obviously in the education space, lots of people have been writing about it, but it's very difficult to work out what has been generated by an AI tool and what has been written by a human, and so therefore to what degree can we weave these tools into education and learning in a way that equips students for jobs that we don't even know exist yet, probably for some of them. So not vilifying it, but being able to incorporate it and think critically about what value it brings and when it's appropriate to be using it and how to use it best.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there's been some stuff that's come out recently, which is quite interesting around that. I know there was an article, and I wish it had been out when I spoke to Steve before, because it would have been interesting to get his opinion on this. But I'll see him in Cambridge at the pub or something, and I'll talk to him about it. But they ran the U.S. Constitution through an AI checker, and it came back saying that it was like 90% it was likely to be written by AI, which I found really interesting. And from what I understand, it has to do with the way that it tries to interpret and to see if if it's about how dense the content is and the word variability, and they have some specialist terms for it, and I can't remember them off the top of my head. But basically, because it was a well-written document, that it flagged it as potentially AI, because there's a certain style. And I suspect that, I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that a lot of academic writing would probably get flagged even if it was written by you, because it's densely written and it's written in a particular style using particular words that aren't maybe used in normal, it's not what somebody would normally use. It's not what somebody in a marketing team would use. And so it keys off of that. And I think a lot of the models were probably mostly trained off of academic papers to begin with. And so, I mean, I don't know if you found this, but I find if you just ask it for, if you ask ChatGPT for a summary, the results you get are very academic sounding, or it's very formal professional language. And I think that's because most of the core training was probably done on those type of documents because that's what was available. And so it works perfectly if you want to use it in some circumstances. Like I find it summarizing something, it's almost 100% correct all the time. Where you really need to check it is when you ask it to write something on its own. But if you put something into ChatGPT, give it papers, give it websites, like whatever, a PDF, and say, summarize this for me, like 99.9% of the time, I'm pretty happy with what it comes back with. And most of the time it comes back with stuff that I didn't even notice. And I read it and I go, wow, okay, I never thought about that. But yeah, that's in there as well. And I'm like, damn, this thing's better than I am. I hate this thing. And I love it at the same time.
But I think that's a really interesting point, though, isn't it? Because I think that's what we're seeing, that it's when it's used in collaboration, so to speak, it's identifying things that maybe you haven't seen. And I guess back to our original point about how can AI help us have these more broad, diverse conversations. It's to the point where the insights from ChatGPT has a really important voice as part of those conversations, and that will take those conversations to different places and potentially find those connections that maybe would have taken us 5 years over a period of time to find. We find in 2 months or whatever it might be. So that's quite, yeah. I'm back on my glass half full.
Excellent.
Place.
We've come back around to the, yeah. We've come away from Mad Packs. We're back. So I'm conscious of time. We're at almost an hour, which has just flown by. So that's been amazing. But a couple of questions have come up randomly, and I don't normally do this, but they've just, I don't know, something in what you just said maybe in the last few minutes made me think of it. But in your mind, it's because we were calling it. So in your mind, is AI male or female?
Oh, it's it. It really is it.
Okay.
What is it for you?
It's female.
Interesting.
And
do you have Alexa at home?
No.
Okay, or a sat nav. Like, what voice have you chosen?
I do have sat nav. I don't know. I don't know what the stats are. I bet there's some really interesting research on sat nav, and do women choose male or female voices, and do men choose male or female voices, and all that. But I think it's because I want to say that Star Trek, the computer voice in Star Trek is female, isn't it? And I think that, I mean, I used to watch that when I was a little kid, when it was on, when it was actually on. And that's how old I am.
At an actual time that you had to tune in on.
Yeah.
And then you had to wait for the next
one
episode.
Channel. Exactly. And yeah, so I think that may have kind of polluted my sort of view of what a computer would be, just because sci-fi, it's mostly female, except for 2001, it's male. Of course, and then it's evil. So you can read into that what you want.
But I think that's exactly where culture is so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
That there's so much in the stories that we have been around and are telling ourselves, and we tell in our communities, that feeds into all of this. That is so fascinating, and we have to include. This is a tech and a people challenge. Yeah. We have to have both at the table for sure.
And I mean, I guess at some point in the future, when it starts to talk to us, we'll just choose whatever voice we want. And it could be our voice or someone else's or whatever. I couldn't think of anything, no offense, but I couldn't think of anything worse than AI being my wife's voice. Like, it'd be like the sat nav. Could you imagine your husband, like your sat nav being your husband, giving you directions all the time? You just feel like, no. I get that enough when he's around. Like, no offense to your husband, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but it could be anyone. Sorry, I'll go back. I'll start over. Your spouse, right? It could be your spouse. Nobody wants their spouse giving them directions in their sat nav all the time. I think that would be really annoying, no matter who you are. But yeah, no, it's interesting. So if you could name it, what would you name it?
Ooh. Oh, no, that's not fair. Oh, gosh. I mean, names are so important. Like, they include meaning. They actually define what you become. That's, oh, my gosh. Oh, no.
You'll have to think about
You've completely stumped me there.
You'll have to think.
Yeah.
These are great.
Do you have a name in mind?
Not a clue.
No, okay. I feel a bit better.
Although when I have random ideas about programs or anything, even if it's like a bot, for some reason I always think it's funny to call it Jeff. And I have no idea why. And I always just go, just ask Jeff. And so I'd probably name it Jeff, actually.
That could work.
Which then goes against my female voice. So I don't know. I don't make any sense. Anyway. It could be. I mean, I have actually developed tools with an acronym that spelled out Jeff. That's how sad I am. But anyway, it's quite funny.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. I heard
Jeff.
it first.
Jeff is coming.
The other one is, and just on this thread, have you seen the Amica robot?
No.
I'll put a link for everybody so you can all go and see it. But it's made down in Devon, and it's been on the BBC and all that sort of stuff. And I was at CES in the US a couple of years ago, and the robot was there down at the end of the UK pavilion thing that we were on, and I got a chance to talk to her a few times. And it was really interesting talking to the guy. Shout out to Will. Will, I still want you on the podcast, so please, if you listen to this, come and talk to me. But I was talking to Will, who was the designer, and it was really interesting because we were talking about the fact that robots tend to be female, and it's because they're less physically threatening, and people accept them more easily, because if you get it's almost like there's this perception that if you have a male robot, it's like Terminator, right?
Culture again, right?
It's but it's like there's like this deep seated. It's more intimidating, and so they want it to. Even though Amica doesn't have a gender, the body of the robot is made to look more female than male. It's really interesting. The whole there's a whole psychology that goes behind that, which is, neither one of our specialties. And that would be a whole great conversation to have. And I do want to have Will on because I think a lot of the scaremongering that happens around AI is also very much tied into robotics. And I don't think robotics is as far along maybe as AI, but I don't know for sure. So I want to have him on because he's an expert in that. But yeah, Will
come on the show.
Yeah, there we go. But yeah, no, it was really interesting, just the psychology behind it. I think I'm going to start asking people that now.
I like that. Yeah.
Is AI, is it male or female, and does it have a name? What would you name it? And
because you could really get an awful lot of insight, I think, from that, just in terms of how people are.
Actually, what I'll do is I'll put a poll on this episode as well. So when the episode comes out, shout out to anybody that's listening, please answer the question, do you think AI is male or female? And I'll leave a comment section for if you would name your personal AI, what would you name it? There we go. Awesome.
Cool.
Ruth, thank you very much. It's been an amazing conversation.
Oh, thank you. It's been really, really fun. Thank you so much.
Hopefully we have given some people things to think about. I will.
And it's just the beginning of the conversation, right? I mean,
100%.
This is just the beginning. So thank you.
As things develop in forensics or anything else, I might want to get you back on to come and talk about that. I tried to kind of stay away from forensics a little too much because I figure you literally talk about that all the time. And that's the only thing that anybody ever talks to you about. So I did want to touch more on the meadow and be more B. So I hope that's okay. And if you want to come back and you want to have a whole totally forensics-based conversation, I'm quite happy to do that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for the chance to talk about the meadow because, I'm really excited by that metaphor and where it might go. So thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing. No, it's great. All right. Thanks very much, Ruth. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, folks, that's a wrap on another amazing episode of Creatives with AI. Thanks so much for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. If you want to stay up to date on how all things related to AI is impacting the creative industries, then be sure to subscribe to the podcast on whatever your favorite platform is. We're on them all. And follow us on social media. We're on mainly Twitter and LinkedIn, but we're the same handle everywhere, which is @Creatives with AI. We'd also really appreciate it if you could just take a minute to leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Those are our two main platforms, and it really helps other listeners find the show, and it also helps us get more popularity and more exposure. So it'd be amazing if you could help us with that. If you've got any questions, topic suggestions, guest recommendations, feel free to send us an email. The best email is hello@creativeswith.ai, or you can shoot us a message on social media. Either one is fine. We love hearing from all of you, and we can't wait to bring more exciting episodes in the future. And the best way we can do that is to get feedback from the audience and have the audience tell us who it is you'd like to hear from and what things you'd like us to ask and what topics you'd like us to talk about. So please use that. Let us know what you want to hear, and we'll do our best to get it for you. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to our sponsor, Futurehead Limited, who make this podcast possible. Your support means the world to us, and we really appreciate it. So thanks very much. That's it for today. So until next time, take care, everybody, and stay curious.